When we speak about grief, most people imagine an emotional experience: sadness, emptiness, longing. And while these feelings are accurate reflections of what it feels like to lose someone or something deeply important, it's crucial to understand that grief is also a biological event rooted in brain and body. It's not merely a psychological phenomenon. It is neurobiological, structured, and measurable within the neural circuitry that regulates attachment, threat detection, reward, and memory. To start with, grief shares pathways with physical pain. Research using functional MRI scans has shown that when people experience social loss, such as the death of a loved one or the ending of a significant relationship, the anterior cingulate cortex becomes active. This region is also activated when we feel physical pain. That's a powerful overlap. FULLY a dist. Ma'aro distant guide T between D the in pain of a BROKENBONE and the nain of a centise of broken HEART and hacution. And this is not just metaphorical. The neurotransmitters involved, such as substance P and endogenous opioids, modulate both physical and emotional pain. The system that signals "this hurts" is at work whether the cause is a burn or a loss. Another major player is the insular cortex, which processes internal emotional states and interoception, our sense of the body's internal landscape. When we feel grief, the insula translates that emotional pain into a bodily sensation. That's why we often feel grief in the chest, stomach, throat, or muscles. These aren't random areas. These are places where the autonomic nervous system interfaces with the brain's emotional processing centers. That heaviness in the chest or pit in the stomach is a literal expression of limbic-autonomic interaction. Now let's explore the limbic system, especially the role of the amygdala and hippocampus. These are evolutionarily older structures that govern emotion and memory. The amygdala is known for its role in fear and threat detection, but it also tags emotional salience to our memories. When someone we love dies or disappears from our lives, the amygdala registers this absence as a major threat to safety. Attachment bonds, especially those formed in childhood or sustained over long periods, are interpreted by the brain as survival, relevant. So their loss triggers a cascade of stress responses. The hippocampus, on the other hand, stores contextual and spatial aspects of memory. It tells us where things happen and how they relate to our personal narrative. After a significant loss, people often report vivid flashbacks, replays of past conversations, dreams, and emotionally loaded memories. This is because the hippocampus and amygdala are tightly linked. Emotional intensity from the amygdala amplifies the strength and accessibility of memories via the hippocampus. This explains why grieving people can be suddenly overwhelmed by random cues, a scent, a song, a certain time of day, that retrieves the memory of the person they lost. Importantly, the brain does not adapt instantly to the absence. It continues to search for the lost person. This is most clearly seen in the activity of the brain's reward and prediction systems, especially the dopaminergic pathways, which run from the ventral tegmental area (VTA) to the nucleus accumbens and prefrontal cortex. These circuits are trained to anticipate rewards like the smile of a loved one or their daily phone call. Even after someone has died, these circuits continue to fire, in anticipation for days, weeks, or months, depending on the individual and the nature of the attachment. This explains the phenomena of momentary confusion, like reaching for the phone to call someone who's gone, or expecting to hear their voice at the door. These are not delusions. They are the natural outputs of prediction-based systems that haven't yet updated their model of the world. In a healthy brain, our internal model, what neuroscientists call a predictive coding framework, is constantly revised by incoming sensory data. But when grief hits, this updating process can stall. The emotional magnitude of the loss creates a kind of inertia in the brain's model. We become stuck between two competing realities, one where the person is still part of our lives and another where they're gone. This ambiguity creates a cognitive dissonance that is both painful and destabilizing. The brain is trying to reconcile prediction with reality, but the emotional cost of that update is enormous. Let's also consider the role of the hypothalamus and its regulation of the autonomic nervous system and endocrine stress responses. Grief activates the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal HPA axis, flooding the system with cortisol. This chronic elevation of stress hormones explains many physiological symptoms associated with grief: insomnia, changes in appetite, compromised immune function, and even cardiovascular irregularities. The heartache of loss, it turns out, is not just poetic. It's a real, measurable strain on cardiac health. In fact, there's a clinical condition known as Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, or broken heart syndrome, where acute grief causes the heart's left ventricle to balloon, mimicking a heart attack. When the HPA axis is activated repeatedly due to prolonged or unresolved grief, it begins to dysregulate the body's circadian rhythms. Melatonin secretion is disrupted, leading to irregular sleep-wake cycles. Sleep is particularly critical during periods of mourning, as it supports the brain's ability to perform memory consolidation and emotional processing. Without restorative sleep, the amygdala becomes hyperactive, and the prefrontal cortex responsible for regulation and rational thought becomes underactive. This creates a state of emotional lability and poor decision-making. It's not just that grief makes us sad, it makes us less neurologically resilient. Another crucial concept here is the role of oxytocin, often referred to as the bonding hormone. Oxytocin levels rise during moments of closeness, hugging a partner, holding a child, even remembering a cherished pet. The withdrawal of that bond leads to a decrease in oxytocin, which contributes to the sense of emotional emptiness and even physical withdrawal symptoms. In fact, the experience of grief often parallels addiction withdrawal. Both involve dopaminergic and oxytocinergic dysregulation, producing symptoms of craving, disorientation, and a profound sense of loss. So what's happening in the brain, functionally speaking, is the breaking of an attachment schema. These are stored in the medial prefrontal cortex and orbitofrontal cortex regions involved in valuation, empathy, and social cognition. They contain our narrative of the other person, how they fit into our life, our identity, and our plans for the future. When that person is gone, the schema doesn't immediately disappear. The brain has to unlearn a relationship that was once central to survival and meaning-making. This unlearning process is not smooth. It is full of neurological friction. The brain's default mode network, which activates during rest, reflection, and self-referential thought, often becomes hyperactive in grief, especially during rumination. This network includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus, among other regions. When this network dominates, we find ourselves caught in cycles of what if, why, and if only. These aren't just thoughts, they're neural loops seeking resolution in an unresolvable situation. Learning to modulate this network through practices like mindfulness, focused attention, and breathwork can eventually help reduce the rumination and bring more clarity. Additionally, mirror neuron systems, which allow us to feel empathy and connection by observing others' behaviors, also play a role in the experience of grief. When we lose someone, the brain's mirror neuron systems still attempt to simulate interaction. This is why we often hear the voice of someone we've lost in our mind, or imagine what they would say in a given moment. These are remnants of co-activated motor and perceptual circuits that developed over years of interaction. Ultimately, the neurobiology of grief tells us that what we're experiencing is not weakness or pathology, it is adaptation. The pain is evidence of attachment, and the complexity of that pain reflects the complexity of our social and emotional bonds. From an evolutionary standpoint, the pain of grief may serve to reinforce the value of social connection, ensuring we don't sever bonds easily and honoring the weight of their absence when they're lost. This neurobiological insight also offers hope. Just as the brain can form attachments, it can also learn to live without them. Through mechanisms of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize and form new connections, we eventually integrate the loss into a new narrative. This doesn't mean forgetting or moving on in a dismissive sense. It means reconfiguring the internal map so that the pain becomes part of the terrain rather than an obstacle. Grief, then, is not a passive state. It is an active neurobiological process. It has structure, stages, and physiological signatures. And most importantly, it has pathways for adaptation and healing. By understanding these mechanisms, we can begin to approach our grief not only with compassion, but with tools informed by science and guided by awareness. The brain that grieves is the same brain that heals, and healing is not the absence of pain, but the reorganization of meaning within the circuits of life and memory. The human experience of grief is profoundly shaped by two primary neurochemical forces, dopamine and cortisol. These two compounds, though often discussed separately, form a complex biological interplay that determines how we process loss, how long grief persists, and what interventions may help us heal. Understanding their roles provides not only a window into the brain's response to grief, but a foundation for intentional recovery strategies rooted in the science of neurobiology. To begin, dopamine is often thought of as the neurotransmitter of pleasure, but its role is far broader and more fundamental. Dopamine is involved in reward prediction, motivation, behavioral reinforcement, and habit formation. In essence, it's the chemical signal that says, "This is important, pay attention." It is released in anticipation of something meaningful, and it plays a large role in driving behavior toward goals, people, routines, and relationships. In the context of human attachment, the dopamine system becomes tightly associated with the people we care about. Every time we experience connection with a loved one, a smile, a phone call, a hug, dopaminergic neurons in areas like the ventral tegmental area VTA and substantia nigra fire, releasing dopamine into target regions such as the nucleus accumbens and the medial prefrontal cortex. Over time, this creates a reinforcement loop. The presence of that person becomes deeply embedded in our reward architecture. Simply anticipating their presence or even recalling a memory is enough to stimulate dopamine release. When a loss occurs, be it through death, separation, or even ambiguous absence, the brain experiences a type of reward prediction error. The expected source of connection and reward fails to appear, and because the dopamine system is wired to anticipate and seek, it continues to fire in expectation. This creates a state of internal agitation. The prediction system is essentially saying, "Where are they?" And the answer keeps returning, "They're not here." That mismatch causes distress, not just emotional but neurochemical. As dopamine levels begin to decline in response to the absence, we see a decrease in motivation, energy, and even physical movement. These are not just symptoms of sadness. They are consequences of diminished dopaminergic tone. Dopamine is involved in initiating action. Without it, the drive to engage in normal daily activities, getting out of bed, eating, socializing, fades. This neurological slowdown is a hallmark of early grief. Simultaneously, the absence of the loved one is interpreted by the brain's threat detection systems, particularly the amygdala, as a serious danger or disruption to the familiar order. This triggers the activation of the hypothalamic pituitary, adrenal HPA axis, initiating the release of cortisol, the primary stress hormone. Unlike dopamine, which is about approach and seeking, cortisol is about vigilance and withdrawal. It prepares the body to survive a perceived threat. In the case of loss, the threat is existential rather than physical, but the biological machinery does not distinguish between the two. Once released by the adrenal glands, cortisol travels throughout the body, impacting multiple systems. It suppresses immune function, increases blood glucose levels, alters digestion, and shifts neural activity toward older, more reactive brain systems. It essentially primes the body for defense. However, when this response is prolonged, as it often is in grief, chronic cortisol elevation becomes harmful. It impairs memory consolidation in the hippocampus, reduces neuroplasticity, and downregulates serotonin receptors, further impairing mood regulation. This combination, low dopamine and high cortisol, creates the classic psychological profile of acute grief. The individual feels unmotivated, emotionally dysregulated, anxious, and fatigued. Sleep often becomes disturbed. This is because both dopamine and cortisol are involved in regulating circadian rhythms. Dopamine helps set the body's internal clock by modulating activity in the suprachiasmatic nucleus SCN of the hypothalamus. Cortisol, on the other hand, follows a diurnal rhythm, peaking in the morning and tapering off by night. But when cortisol remains elevated at night due to unresolved stress, it disrupts sleep onset and reduces REM sleep, which is crucial for emotional processing. It is important to emphasize that this neurochemical profile is not a disorder. It is a functional, adaptive response by the brain to a rupture in its relational ecosystem. The loss of a loved one removes a key regulator of our internal homeostases. Many of our dopamine pathways are organized around those relationships. The routines, conversations, shared meals, and mutual care are not just habits. They are neurochemical rituals that stabilize the self. When they vanish, the brain enters a withdrawal state, not unlike substance withdrawal. This explains the shaking, crying, craving, and even hallucinations or vivid dreams people may report. The reason this is crucial to understand is because it removes the stigma from grief. These reactions are not about weakness. They are about neurochemical recalibration. The brain must find new dopamine sources. It must learn to lower cortisol through means other than safety in relationship. And this takes time, effort, and often guidance. One of the core problems in grief is the absence of dopaminergic feedback. When people are deeply grieving, they often feel that nothing brings joy. Not music, not food, not conversation. This is because their dopamine systems are desensitized or underactive. However, neuroscience tells us that dopamine is not only released by pleasure, but by novelty, effort, and purpose. Engaging in even small tasks, walking, organizing, creating, can begin to nudge the dopamine system back into gear. This is often called behavioral activation in psychological therapies, and its success is grounded in solid neurobiology. Similarly, cortisol can be modulated through direct interventions. The most accessible is respiration. Controlled breathing, particularly slow, diaphragmatic exhalation activates the parasympathetic nervous system via the vagus nerve. This reduces heart rate, lowers blood pressure, and signals the hypothalamus to downregulate cortisol production. Even 5 minutes of slow, paced breathing can have measurable effects on cortisol levels and emotional stability. Another powerful modulator is light. Morning sunlight exposure increases dopamine via melanopsin, expressing retinal ganglion cells which project to the brain's reward centers. It also helps regulate cortisol rhythms, anchoring the stress cycle to a predictable circadian pattern. People in grief often feel untethered from time. Reestablishing a light, dark rhythm through daily exposure to natural light can help reintegrate the body and brain into a functional temporal framework. Exercise also plays a critical role. Moderate aerobic exercise has been shown to increase levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which supports the growth and survival of dopamine neurons. It also boosts endorphins, which work on opioid receptors to provide natural analgesia. This is especially relevant given that grief activates the same pain circuits as physical injury. Movement, even when not emotionally motivated, creates a bottom-up signal to the brain that can help shift emotional states. It's also worth noting that social connection can support both dopamine and cortisol regulation. Being with others, especially those we trust and feel safe with, stimulates oxytocin release. Oxytocin, in turn, modulates the HPA axis and reduces cortisol secretion. In this way, connection is not just comforting, it is neurochemically reparative. That said, people in grief often withdraw socially. This is understandable given their emotional state, but even brief, low-pressure social interactions can offer neurobiological support. It's not about forcing cheerfulness, it's about sustaining the neural circuits of interpersonal safety. As grief progresses, the brain begins to adapt. Dopamine pathways begin to form new associations. The goal is not to replace the lost person, but to reallocate attention, energy, and reward signals toward new behaviors, roles, and identities. This takes time and is often non-linear. There may be periods of renewed sadness or unexpected waves of grief. These fluctuations are reflections of the brain's ongoing recalibration, testing predictions, revising expectations, and learning to experience pleasure without the one who was lost. This adaptation can be supported by cognitive reframing, actively shaping how the loss is integrated into one's worldview. Studies show that the way we interpret and experience influences not just our psychology, but our neurobiology. When people are able to assign meaning to their loss, whether through spiritual frameworks, legacy, building, or helping others, they often show lower cortisol levels and more resilient dopaminergic activity. The meaning doesn't erase the pain, but it provides structure, and structure is essential for the brain to reorganize around new patterns of behavior and emotion. One emerging area of research even points to the role of psychedelics, such as psilocybin, in modulating the dopamine, serotonin systems in a way that can alleviate prolonged grief. While this field is still developing and not appropriate for everyone, the idea is based on the principle of enhanced neuroplasticity. Psychedelics appear to temporarily increase the brain's capacity to form new connections and weaken rigid networks, such as those involved in persistent rumination or trauma. This is another example of how modulating neurochemistry can affect the deeper layers of emotional recovery. In conclusion, dopamine and cortisol are not just background molecules, they are central to the grieving process. Dopamine governs our sense of meaning and pursuit. Cortisol governs our safety and stress responses. When we lose someone, both systems are thrown into disarray, but by understanding their function, we can approach grief as a process of rebalancing these systems. We can use breath, movement, light, social connection, and purpose to gradually restore a sense of equilibrium. This biological lens does not diminish the sacredness of grief, it enhances our ability to move through it with awareness, self-compassion, and eventually healing. The same brain that breaks under the weight of loss holds within it the tools to rebuild. The circuitry of love, attachment, and loss is, in the end, the circuitry of resilience. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to change its structure and function in response to experience. It is the reason we can learn new skills, form new memories, adapt to new environments, and, crucially, recover from emotional pain. After a significant loss, the very neural networks that supported attachment, routine, and emotional regulation are disrupted. What neuroplasticity offers is not just the capacity to endure this disruption, but to reorganize, to rebuild new circuits that can stabilize the self in a changed reality. The foundation of neuroplastic change lies in Hebb's postulate, neurons that fire together wire together. In the context of grief, this principle has a powerful implication. Many of our neural connections are wired around another person, their presence, voice, smell, habits, and the predictability of their actions. Each time we experience joy, comfort, or regulation through them, those experiences were encoded via repeated patterns of neural activity. When that person is gone, the circuits associated with their presence are no longer reinforced. But the patterns still exist, and the brain struggles to reconcile the absence of input with the persistence of expectation. This is one reason grief feels like confusion. The hippocampus, which stores contextual memories, continues to prompt reminders of the person, places they were, phrases they used, the time of day they would typically call. The prefrontal cortex attempts to update reality, while deeper emotionally, latent circuits in the amygdala and insula keep reacting as if the bond remains active. This mismatch is part of what makes early grief feel disorienting. However, through neuroplasticity, the brain gradually prunes unused connections and strengthens new ones, if, and only if, the right conditions are met. One of the most important conditions for neuroplasticity is attention. What we attend to repeatedly will shape the architecture of our brain. In the grieving process, attention often becomes fixated on the loss itself, on what was, on what could have been. This is natural, but if sustained indefinitely, it can lead to rigid circuits that resist change. Rewiring the brain after loss involves gently shifting attention, bit by bit toward the present and toward signals of safety, novelty, and purpose. Another critical factor is emotional salience. Neuroplastic changes are more likely to occur when emotional intensity is high. This is why emotionally charged memories are so vivid and persistent. After loss, the brain enters a highly plastic yet vulnerable state. Everything is tinged with emotion, whether it's sadness, longing, or despair. From a neurobiological standpoint, this is a sensitive window. What you expose yourself to during this period, what you repeat, what you reflect on, what you allow yourself to feel, can become the foundation of long-term neural rewiring. This is why intentional practices like journaling, somatic therapies, and structured reflection are so powerful. They direct the brain's plastic resources toward processing and integrating the loss, rather than reinforcing avoidance or reactivity. Writing about grief, especially when done consistently, activates the medial prefrontal cortex, a region involved in meaning-making and emotion regulation. When this region engages in tandem with the amygdala, it creates a top-down modulation that can gradually reduce the intensity of grief responses over time. In practical terms, this means setting aside time to actively engage with your grief rather than passively endure it. Labeling emotions, saying, "I feel lonely," or "I feel confused," may seem simple, but it recruits areas like the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which have been shown in neuroimaging studies to reduce amygdala activation. Naming feelings creates distance. It turns chaos into information. This kind of reflective practice is a form of cognitive reappraisal, which is known to promote adaptive neuroplasticity. But neuroplasticity is not just a cognitive phenomenon, it's also somatic. The body carries implicit memories of safety and danger, and the autonomic nervous system is deeply involved in grief processing. This is why breathwork, yoga, and trauma-informed movement therapies can be so transformative. These practices stimulate the vagus nerve, which connects the brainstem to key organs and regulates the parasympathetic response. A well-toned vagus nerve enhances the brain's ability to switch from a reactive, survival-based state into a receptive, learning-based state, a prerequisite for plastic change. It's important to understand that while grief often feels like emotional pain, it also activates physical pain circuits. Neuroimaging studies show that regions such as the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and insular cortex, areas also involved in physical pain, are active during experiences of social loss. This suggests that the brain treats the absence of a loved one similarly to injury. In fact, opioids, both endogenous and exogenous, can reduce grief-related suffering, which has led to the exploration of certain compounds in grief therapy. But more relevant here is the fact that movement, touch, and even rhythmic stimulation, like drumming or dance, can activate these same pain relief pathways naturally and support healthy rewiring. One key insight is that novelty enhances plasticity. When the brain is exposed to something unfamiliar but not overwhelming, it releases neuromodulators like acetylcholine and norepinephrine. These chemicals amplify attention and prepare the brain to encode new information. For someone in grief, this means that engaging in small new experiences, taking a different route to work, learning a new skill, even changing the layout of a room, can help the brain establish new reference points. The loss remains real, but the neural context begins to shift. Even more effective is pairing novelty with meaning. If a grieving person takes up something they consider purposeful, volunteering, teaching, creating art, or helping others, it can activate not just dopamine and oxytocin, but neurotrophic factors like BDNF, which support neuronal growth and synaptic strengthening. This is why many people report that their most profound transformation came through channeling grief into service. From a neurobiological standpoint, they are not just coping. They are repurposing their brain's architecture to sustain a new version of self that includes the loss but is not defined by it. It's also critical to recognize the role of rest and sleep in neuroplasticity. Most structural brain changes happen not while we are awake, but during deep sleep and REM cycles. During these phases, the brain consolidates emotional memories, weakens irrelevant synapses, and strengthens those associated with new learning. People in grief often experience disrupted sleep patterns, delayed sleep onset, fragmented rest, and early morning awakening. This deprives the brain of its natural opportunity to rewire. To address this, practices that promote sleep hygiene become essential. Avoiding screens before bed, using dim lighting in the evening, maintaining a consistent sleep schedule, and engaging in pre-sleep relaxation rituals can all support the transition into restorative sleep. Supplementation with compounds like magnesium threonate or the amino acid L-theanine may also support sleep architecture, although this should be guided by individual needs and ideally discussed with a healthcare professional. From a systems perspective, it's important to understand that neuroplasticity is not uniform across the lifespan. Children and adolescents have more spontaneous plasticity, meaning their brains change easily. Adults have more experience, dependent plasticity, meaning change is possible, but requires intentional effort and repetition. In the context of adult grief, this means we must create conditions of focused attention, emotional engagement, and behavioral consistency to activate neuroplastic pathways. It won't happen simply through time, it happens through structured adaptation. There is also the question of maladaptive plasticity. The brain can wire itself in unhelpful ways if grief becomes chronic or complicated. Persistent rumination, avoidance, or substance use can strengthen circuits that trap the individual in states of despair or denial. These are not failures of willpower, they are consequences of reinforced neural pathways. But because of the brain's plastic nature, these patterns can be weakened through redirection, new habits, and in some cases, clinical intervention such as cognitive behavioral therapy or EMDR, which uses bilateral stimulation to modify traumatic memory traces. As we zoom out, we can conceptualize grief recovery as a neurobiological process of adaptation, breaking old predictions, forming new ones, and gradually stabilizing internal states in a changed external world. The grieving brain isn't trying to forget. It's trying to learn how to live differently. And this requires repeated exposure to both emotion and action, feeling the loss while also engaging with life. One final element worth exploring is the impact of self-directed neuroplasticity. This is the process of using conscious practices, such as meditation, visualization, and focused intention, to guide brain rewiring. Studies show that visualization activates many of the same neural networks as actual behavior. When grieving individuals visualize themselves engaging in healing behaviors such as connecting with others, expressing their emotions, or creating meaning, they begin to pre-activate those circuits. This makes the actual behavior more likely, and the associated neural change more robust. Meditative practices, especially mindfulness, can also reduce activity in the default mode network, a brain system associated with self-referential thought and rumination. When the default mode network is overactive, people tend to fixate on the past and engage in repetitive negative thinking. Mindfulness meditation has been shown to reduce this activity and increase connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and limbic regions, facilitating emotional regulation. In grieving individuals, this can accelerate the integration of loss and support the emergence of a more balanced emotional state. In summary, the brain's capacity to rewire itself after loss is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, biologically grounded process. It involves pruning of old synaptic patterns, strengthening of new ones, and the gradual recalibration of emotion, cognition, and behavior. This process is driven by neuroplasticity and can be actively supported through practices that engage the body, direct attention, cultivate novelty, restore sleep, and align meaning with action. Grief does not disappear, but through plasticity, it can be transformed into something that lives alongside healing. The circuits of loss become the circuits of memory, and in time they can coexist with circuits of renewal, resilience, and even joy. One of the most essential, yet often overlooked, dimensions of healing from grief is the process of narrative reconstruction, shaping a new internal story that integrates the loss into a broader framework of meaning. From a neuroscientific standpoint, our sense of self is not static or fixed. It is a dynamic, continuously updated construct composed of memories, beliefs, emotional patterns, and predictive models that guide how we experience the world. Loss doesn't just remove a person from our life, it disrupts the very narrative scaffolding through which we interpret who we are. The death of a loved one, the end of a deep relationship, or the sudden absence of a life-defining figure fragments the continuity of self, and to heal, the brain must reorganize that story. This process is not just psychological, it is deeply biological. The medial prefrontal cortex and the default mode network are key players in self-referential thought and autobiographical memory. These brain systems are constantly generating simulations of self in context, often running in the background of consciousness. When someone we are attached to dies or leaves, the brain continues to simulate interactions with them for a period of time. These simulations often emerge as mental imagery, dreams, or moments of mistaken expectation, reaching for the phone to call someone who is no longer alive, for example. This is not an error in cognition. It's evidence of the deep wiring that supports our sense of relational identity. Initially, these internal simulations serve an adaptive function. They help maintain coherence in the face of rupture. But over time, if the brain does not update these models to reflect the new reality, it can lead to prolonged emotional dysregulation, internal conflict, and a fragmented self-narrative. The goal of narrative integration is to allow the brain's predictive and memory systems to reconcile the past with the present, to convert the pain of absence into a form of presence that can coexist. With continued growth, this requires several overlapping neural and psychological mechanisms. First is memory reconsolidation, a process through which previously encoded memories become labile or malleable when retrieved and can be updated with new emotional context. This is crucial in grief work. Each time we remember the person or the loss, the emotional tone of that memory can be subtly shifted depending on what we pair with it. For example, revisiting a painful memory in the context of compassion or safety, even if self-generated, can change the emotional tagging of that memory. Over time, this reduces the intensity of the grief response and allows the memory to be integrated into a broader narrative arc. Research in effective neuroscience supports this. Studies show that when memories are updated during a period of emotional safety or meaning, making, the amygdala involved in fear and threat processing becomes less reactive over time, and the hippocampus responsible for contextualizing memories can encode the updated information more effectively. This is one reason why grief support groups, therapy, and even structured journaling can be so beneficial. They create environments where painful memories can be reaccessed without re-traumatization. Leading to more adaptive encoding, one of the more advanced forms of narrative integration involves shifting from first-person emotional to third-person reflective processing. This means moving from reliving the grief, experiencing it as raw and immediate, to observing it as part of a larger pattern in your life story. Functional MRI studies have shown that this shift in perspective activates the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and reduces activity in the midline regions of the brain associated with emotional salience. In other words, stepping back and observing your grief rather than being consumed by it recruits executive functions that can help stabilize the emotional system. This reflective processing can be supported through certain cognitive practices. One of the most studied is expressive writing, where individuals are instructed to write about their deepest thoughts and feelings related to the loss over multiple sessions. This technique, developed by psychologist James Pennebaker, has shown consistent benefits in reducing physiological stress markers, improving immune function, and enhancing emotional regulation. Neuroimaging studies suggest that expressive writing increases functional connectivity between the language centers of the brain, such as Broca's area, and emotional regulation regions, facilitating verbal and cognitive integration of emotional experience. But integrating loss into identity goes beyond memory work. It involves making choices about the meaning we assign to suffering. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and neurologist, famously observed that humans can endure almost any how, if they have a why. The neuroscience behind this insight lies in the brain's reward and motivation systems. When we construct meaning around our loss, when we say, "Because of this, I will live differently," or "This pain taught me something I needed to learn," we engage the mesolimbic dopamine system. Dopamine is not just the molecule of pleasure, it's the molecule of motivation and forward movement. Meaning provides a reward signal that can help counterbalance the pain, and it gives the brain a future to move toward. This is where purpose enters the healing equation. When we find ways to act in alignment with the values we discovered through our loss, whether it's protecting others, living more honestly, creating something in the memory of who or what was lost, we create new neural circuits around agency. Agency is the sense that I can affect my life and world, and it's mediated by a network of brain areas including the anterior cingulate cortex and prefrontal cortex. Agency buffers against helplessness, a common feature of traumatic grief, and strengthens the sense of a coherent self. There is also a relational dimension to narrative reconstruction. Our self concept is socially embedded, shaped by others, maintained through language and interaction. After a loss, especially if the person was a central attachment figure, social isolation can compound the disintegration of self. This is why grief can feel existentially lonely even in the presence of others. From a neurobiological perspective, human connection helps regulate the stress response and supports identity restoration. Interacting with empathetic others activates mirror neurons and oxytocin pathways, promoting bonding and trust. In grief, talking to someone who truly listens is not just emotionally soothing. It is a biological signal that we are not alone and that we can still exist in the world even after the unthinkable. One profound aspect of integrating loss into a new self-narrative is the idea of post-traumatic growth. While not universal, many individuals report that grief led to an expansion of perspective, a deepening of values, and a greater appreciation of life. The neural correlates of post-traumatic growth involve the balance of networks specifically, increased connectivity between the default mode network involved in introspection, the salience network which determines what to pay attention to, and the executive control network, which governs planning and regulation. This trine-network interaction allows for adaptive meaning making, a kind of reconfiguration of the internal model of the world in light of what has occurred. It's critical, however, not to force this growth prematurely. The brain and body must first feel safe before they can adapt. Premature attempts to be positive or move on can bypass necessary emotional processing and lead to what is called pseudo-adaptation, where the individual appears functional but remains fragmented internally. The goal is not to erase the pain, but to allow it to become part of the landscape of the self, something you carry, yes, but not something that defines or disables you. Spirituality, whether religious or secular, often plays a significant role in helping individuals contextualize their loss. From a neural standpoint, spiritual practices like prayer, meditation, and ritual modulate areas such as the posterior cingulate cortex and the temporal, parietal junction, which are involved in self-transcendence and perspective-taking. These practices can reduce rumination and foster a sense of continuity between past, present, and future. For many, this continuity becomes the new narrative thread that sustains identity. I am changed but not ended. I carry forward what was lost. Ultimately, the integration of loss into a new narrative of self is an ongoing, nonlinear process. There will be regressions, unexpected triggers, moments of identity confusion. But each encounter with grief is also an opportunity to update the internal model of who you are. Every time you act with compassion in memory of the one you lost, every time you choose connection over withdrawal, every time you create meaning where there was once only pain, you are not just coping, you are engaging in neurobiological construction of a renewed self. The self is not one thing. It is a pattern, a dynamic living system encoded in the activity of neurons, shaped by experiences, and continuously rewritten. Loss is perhaps the most powerful force that can destabilize this system, but it is also the very force that can deepen and enrich it. Through the deliberate, compassionate integration of what was lost, you create a version of self that does not live in denial of grief, but rather is expanded by it. The person you were is not gone, but transformed, made more complex, more conscious, and in many cases, more capable of love because of the depth of your loss. In the end, the most healing question may not be, how do I get over this? But rather, how can I carry this in a way that honors my life and theirs? The answer to that question is the new narrative, and the brain, with all its adaptive capacity, is ready to help you write it.